We're on to chapter 16 of A Course in Miracles, and this chapter is called The Forgiveness of Illusions. So by the end of the chapter, all our illusions will be forgiven. They have already been forgiven. We're on section 1, and this is called True Empathy. There's no introduction to this chapter. True empathy, here we go. To empathize does not mean to join in suffering, for that is what you must refuse to understand. That is the ego's interpretation of empathy and is always used to form a special relationship in which the suffering is shared. The capacity to empathize is very useful to the Holy Spirit, provided you let him use it in his way. His way is very different. He does not understand suffering, and would have you teach it is not understandable. When he relates through you, he does not relate through your ego to another ego. He does not join in pain, understanding that healing pain is not accomplished by delusional attempts to enter into it and lighten it by sharing the delusion. The clearest proof that empathy as the ego uses it is destructive lies in the fact that it is applied only to certain types of problems and in certain people. These it selects out and joins with, and it never joins except to strengthen itself. Having identified with what it thinks it understands, the ego sees itself and would increase itself by sharing what is like itself. Make no mistake about this maneuver. The ego always empathizes to weaken, and to weaken is always to attack. You do not know what empathizing means. Yet of this you may be sure, if you will merely sit quietly by and let the Holy Spirit relate through you, you will empathize with strength and will gain in strength and not in weakness. Your part is only to remember this: you do not want anything you value to come of a relationship. You choose neither to hurt it nor to heal it in your own way. You do not know what healing is. All you have learned of empathy is from the past, and there is nothing from the past that you would share, for there is nothing from the past that you would keep. Do not use empathy to make the past real and so perpetuate it. Step gently aside and let healing be done for you. Keep but one thought in mind and do not lose sight of it, however tempted you may be to judge any situation and to determine your response by judging it. Focus your mind only on this: I am not alone, and I would not intrude the past upon my guest. I have invited him, and he is here. I need do nothing except not to interfere. True empathy is of him who knows what it is. You will learn his interpretation of it if you let him use your capacity for strength and not for weakness. He will not desert you, but be sure that you desert not him. Humility is strength in this sense only, that to recognize and accept the fact that you do not know is to recognize and accept the fact that he does know. You are not sure that he will do his part because you have never yet done yours completely. You cannot know how to respond to what you do not understand. Be tempted not in this, and yield not to the ego's triumphant use of empathy for its glory. The triumph of weakness is not what you would offer to a brother, and yet you recognize no triumph but this. This is not knowledge, and the form of empathy which would bring this about is so distorted that it would imprison what it would release. The unredeemed cannot redeem, yet they have a redeemer. Attempt to teach him not. You are the learner, he the teacher. Do not confuse your role with his, for this will never bring peace to anyone. Offer your empathy to him, for it is his perception and his strength that you would share. And let him offer you his strength and his perception to be shared through you. The meaning of love is lost in any relationship that looks to weakness and hopes to find love there. The power of love, which is its meaning, lies in the strength of God that hovers over it and blesses it silently by enveloping it in healing wings. Let this be, and do not try to substitute your, quote, miracle, unquote, for this. I have said that if a brother asks a foolish thing of you, to do it. But be certain that this does not mean to do a foolish thing that would hurt either him or you, for what would hurt one will hurt the other. Foolish requests are foolish merely because they conflict, since they always contain some element of specialness. Only the Holy Spirit recognizes foolish needs as well as real ones, and he will teach you how to meet both without losing either. You will attempt to do this only in secrecy, and you will think that by meeting the needs of one, you do not jeopardize the other, because you keep them separate and secret from each other. That is not the way, for it leads not to life and truth. No needs will long be left unmet if you leave them all to him whose function is to meet them. That is his function and not yours. He will not meet them secretly, for he would share everything you give through him. That is why he gives it. What you give through him is for the whole sonship, not for part of it. Leave him his function, for he will fulfill it if you but ask him to enter your relationships and bless them for you. Okay, true empathy. It's the name of the section here. And the chapter is called The Forgiveness of Illusions. Obviously, Jesus is bringing in the concept of empathy here. And this is a running theme throughout the course. I don't know if Jesus has talked too much about empathy yet, but now he's really getting into empathy. Now, we all place a value on being empathetic. For us, empathy is a wonderful thing in relationships. Like when someone is in pain, when someone is struggling, when someone is upset, in tears, hurting, whatever it may be, traumatized, we do put a value on being empathetic, right? Feeling someone else's pain and sharing their pain with them, however, to the best we can. Now, remember when Bill Clinton said, "I feel your pain," right? And people didn't think that was real, for a president to say, "We feel your pain," or "I feel your pain." It was a nice thing to say, actually, on his part, if he really said it, or if his speechwriter wrote it. But people didn't take that very seriously. And the truth is that generally, some people are very sensitive, and some people not only feel the pain of others, but take on the pain of others, right? So that it becomes theirs, and they suffer as a result of being so empathetic that they take on the suffering of others. And we would say that is valuable, and maybe on some level it is. Now Jesus is talking about empathy here in a different way. Remember that he uses all these different concepts that we are familiar with, but he uses them in a different way. And most of the time they're like completely opposite of what we think they are, right? Because I was just talking about empathy as we generally think of it. And we generally think of it in a very positive way, that when we empathize with someone's pain and suffering. Now Jesus is here is saying, along the lines of what he's been saying, empathy here would be when we meet someone else's ego with our own ego, and we join with ego versus the Holy Spirit, seeing the situation through the eyes of the Holy Spirit. That's what Jesus is saying is that we don't want to do. That would be true empathy, would be when we meet our brother or meet the other on the level of the Holy Spirit versus the ego. That would be true empathy. To empathize does not mean to join in suffering, for that is what you must refuse to understand. So suffering of any kind, we do not want to make real. Jesus keeps saying again and again. Why? Because suffering is not real. The atonement principle is the principle, and everything really goes back to this one principle. This is the only thing that we really need to accept is the atonement. And the atonement principle is that suffering is not real because separation from God never happened. We are not separate from each other. We are not separate from God. Suffering is unreal. And if we make suffering real in any way, we are making a mistake that we will have to unlearn or undo. It's not a sin. There is no sin. It's just, again, it's just a mistake in our understanding, in our perception. And we have to align our perception with the Holy Spirit. And Jesus is saying here that we cannot do this ourselves because we are so conditioned according to the ego's thought system. We do see the past. The Holy Spirit does not see the past. The Holy Spirit only sees the eternal now, right? The Holy Spirit acknowledges these things. Let's read this. The Holy Spirit acknowledges these things, but does not make them real. The capacity to empathize is very useful to the Holy Spirit, provided you let him use it in his way. His way is very different. He does not understand suffering, and would have you teach it is not understandable. So the Holy Spirit sees the suffering, but does not mean anything, right? There is no suffering according to the Holy Spirit because there's no judgment. And if there's no judgment, there's no guilt. And if there's no guilt, there's no punishment. And if there's no punishment, there is no suffering. There can be no pain and suffering. That is all part of that illusionary thought system that we are undoing here. So the ego, just to make a long teaching short, there is no suffering. It's not even about seeing the suffering and saying it's not real, but in reality there is no suffering. No one really suffers. No one truly suffers. That is the illusion. That is the illusion. That is the veil. That is the veil of illusion. This section is called the forgiveness of illusions. And one major illusion, the only real illusion, is that suffering is real. Now this is a big one. I ended the last video talking about when we see people greatly traumatized, and when people are really in the midst of their suffering for whatever reason, and sometimes it does look very scary, very real, very upsetting. I mean, this is all an understatement, because there are some really horrific appearing things that happen in this world, and some things that most everyone cannot accept, like the torture of children, or the rape of especially young people, and the abuse of young people and children. And these are the kinds of things that most everyone finds unacceptable, and really it is unacceptable. and Jesus actually touches upon this. I'm going to touch upon it here in a moment, but it is unacceptable, and it's not like we just let that go. Well, we try to do something about it. On the other hand, there's a difference between doing something about it and how we think about it, and how we leave it to the Holy Spirit to see it the way the Holy Spirit sees it, which is that suffering is not real. That does not mean that we tell other people who are suffering that suffering is not real, because that's not compassionate, that's not loving to do that, because for them it is real. And so why would we, that would add insult to injury, and maybe even be worse than what they're undergoing to do that to them, right? Someone is just got very hurt is crying in pain, and you say something to them that insults them, or that rubs against their thought system, and that is just as traumatic, maybe, if not more traumatic. So Jesus mentions this very interesting thing here, that Jesus brings back something he said earlier in an earlier chapter. I forget which chapter, but Jesus said the famous statement that Jesus made earlier, which is, if a brother asks you to do something outrageous, do it, because it doesn't matter. I may be misquoting slightly, but here he says, he doesn't use the word outrageous here, but he's referring to it. He says, I have said that if a brother asks a foolish thing of you, to do it, but be certain that this does not mean to do a foolish thing that would hurt either him or you, for what would hurt one will hurt the other. Foolish requests are foolish merely because they conflict, since they always contain some element of specialness. So if your brother asks you to do something outrageous, it's more about to look at what your brother is asking and see that you don't bring your ego into it. Right? Your brother asks you to be in his suffering, let's say, with him, or her suffering with her. Now, Jesus is saying, don't do it. It's a temptation to empathize with their suffering and make it real. But that is exactly what you do not want to do. Now, how you do that is in the moment. It depends on the situation. It's not to say that there is a right or wrong way to do it, that you can give some kind of generic overarching way to do that. But Jesus is saying, at least do not make the suffering real in your own mind, and don't let the other person feel that you're making it real either. But help them, give it up to the Holy Spirit, meaning give it up to the place within yourself where suffering does not exist, suffering is not understandable, suffering is not real, and try to meet that person in that place. And when you do that, they get it too. Not only do they get it, but it reinforces for you as well. And everyone is uplifted in the process. As soon as you make the suffering real, though, you make the ego real. You make the illusion even more real. This is very challenging, just like this course is written at a very high level. That's why it's very difficult to understand. That's why I'm reading it, because it's very difficult to understand. It's difficult to understand when it's read aloud too, and I've said this before, because so many of the pronouns here are capitalized, and even some words are capitalized, and you don't even know when I'm reading it out loud which words are capitalized. For example, Jesus says, focus your mind, keep but one thought in mind, and do not lose sight of it, however tempted you may be to judge any situation and to determine your response by judging it. Focus your mind only on this. And then he says, this is all in italics. I am not alone, and I would not intrude the past upon my guest. Guest there is capitalized. The guest is referring to the Holy Spirit. But in a way, the guest is also the person, your brother, right? I have invited him, and he is here. I need do nothing except not to interfere. So I have invited the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit is here. And all I have to do is not interfere with the Holy Spirit. I cannot heal. And Jesus says here, you do not know what healing is. Right? We do not know what healing is. We have to learn how to get out of the way. Let the healing happen through us, not by us, because once again, we're We are an unhealed healer. If we were fully healed, then we could. But we are not fully healed. We are the wounded healer, the unhealed healer. So we need to learn how to get out of the way and let the Holy Spirit, or let Spirit work through us. So I will say more. That's good. That was 20 minutes. Our next section is called The Power of Holiness. See you soon. Thank you for listening. Comments and feedback are always welcome. See you soon.